Good morning, everybody. Why don't we start this sermon with prayer? Inviting the Holy Spirit to have authority in your time together, inviting Him to speak to you and speak through you and encourage others, inviting Him to pray through you. If you have a way of doing musical worship, do that now. And remember, this week we're praying for our persecuted church of Sudan, especially the Muslim background believers who under the law can be put to death. Why don't you pause and pray for that now? And now let's pause and discuss this question. Have you ever heard the term of Antichrist? And if you have, what do you know about this word? Pause now and go ahead. Okay, let's read Revelation 13 today, because we're going to spend the next few weeks just taking a new series route, okay? Let's start in verse 1. The dragon, that is the devil, stood on the shore of the sea, and I saw a beast coming out of the sea. It had 10 horns and 7 heads with 10 crowns on its horns, and on each head a blasphemous name. The beast I saw resembled a leopard, but it had feet like those of a bear and a mouth like that of a lion. The dragon gave the beast his power and his throne and great authority. One of the heads of the beast seemed to have had a fatal wound, but the fatal wound had been healed. The whole world was filled with wonder and followed the beast. People worshiped the dragon because he had given authority to the beast, and they also worshiped the beast and asked, "Who is like the beast? Who can wage war against it?" The beast was given a mouth to utter proud words and blasphemies and to exercise its authority for 42 months. It opened its mouth to blaspheme God and to slander his name and his dwelling place and those who live in heaven. It was given power to wage war against God's holy people and to conquer them. And it was given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. All inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast, all those whose names have not been written in the Lamb's book of life, the Lamb who was slain from the creation of the world. Whoever has ears, let them hear. If anyone is to go into captivity they will go. If anyone is to be killed with the sword they will be killed. This calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of God's people. Then I saw a second beast coming out of the earth. It had 2 horns like a lamb, but it spoke like a dragon. It exercised all the authority of the first beast on its behalf and made the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose fatal wound had been healed. And it performed great signs, even causing fire to come down from heaven to the earth in full view of the people. Because of the signs it was given power to perform on behalf of the first beast, it deceived the inhabitants of the earth. It ordered them to set up an image in honor of the beast who was wounded by the sword and yet lived. The second beast was given power to give breath to the image of the first beast, so that the image could speak and cause all who refused to worship the image to be killed. It also forced all people, great and small, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hands and on their foreheads, so that they could not buy or sell unless they had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of its name. This calls for wisdom. Let the person who has insight calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. The number is 666. All right, we're going to solve the mark of the beast today. I'm just kidding. That's not where we're going with this. Many people are fascinated by this passage and what awaits the last days of the world. We have an image here of Satan, the dragon, and one day he will call from the chaos and the rebellion of the world 2 human beings, described here as beasts for perhaps many reasons, probably their beastly behavior and their beastly convictions of truth. One is a ruler, elsewhere called Antichrist. The other is a false prophet to draw the people of the world to the Antichrist. Both of them will direct worship to the dragon. Today, I want to begin by just asking the question, what do we notice about Antichrist's rule? Well, we notice a few things. In verse 2, we mark that he aims for authority. The nature of demonic rule is to seek all authority for oneself. The enemy of God is power-driven, seeking absolute control. He will stretch out in verse 7 to grasp the entire globe. And you'd think that's not even enough. In fact, it's not. Under him, Revelation 7:13 tells us, there will serve 10 kings, and they will have, quote, one purpose. That will be to give their power and authority to the beast. He lives for power and control. Daniel 7:23 tells us of the predatory nature of this rule, the desire to advance himself, not really to make things better for anyone else. He's described as devouring the whole earth in Daniel's words. And those he conquers, he tramples down and crushes. Daniel 11 verse 39 tells us that even from those 10 kings that he sets up, he will exact his price in blood. That is, he will, again quotes, distribute the land at a price, end quote. In other words, he'll sell power, because from the power that he owns, he wants to get something from it if he's to share it. He wants to profit even from his captains. But more can be said about his rule. In verse 4, we see that it's not enough to rule over the bodies and wealth of men. We're in Revelation 13 again here, remember. He requires the devotion of their souls. He's not just a ruler, he wants to be a lover for the twisted heart. In his codependence, brutal codependence, he needs to be their everything. He aspires to divinity over the human soul. And verse 8 tells us he will achieve this worship for the first time of anyone but Jesus Christ from every nation on earth. His quest is to obtain more than merely human devotion, however. He aims to unseat the Most High God. Verse 5 tells us that he will tear down God in the eyes of humanity, blaspheming, discrediting, slandering. He's utterly irreverent to anything but his own boundless ego. He accepts no boundaries for himself. This has been prophesied 500 years earlier by Daniel, who foresaw a king who would come, who would aim to do what he pleased, who would exalt and magnify himself above every god and say unheard of things against the God of gods. Daniel 11, verse 36. Whew, pride. As the Apostle Paul tells the Thessalonians, he will oppose and will exalt himself over everything that is called God or is worshipped, everything. He doesn't share. So that he sets himself up in God's temple, proclaiming himself to be God. 2 Thessalonians 2, verse 4. For this reason, this king aims to wage war. His war, Revelation 17:14 says, is ultimately against the Lamb. But it turns out the Lamb, which is Jesus, which is God, isn't easily grasped. Have you noticed that? So this senseless beast turns his wrath instead against the next closest thing, God's people. And Daniel 7:25 again had foretold that the Antichrist would succeed in oppressing the holy people. And Revelation 13 verse 15, which we've just read, also tells us he will put many to death. You see, those who will not comply with his program have no place in the beast's world. They're utterly, I mean utterly intolerable. This is not a program of diverse peace. It is a totalitarian conquest to control everything without mercy. And what tools will this enemy employ to conquer humanity? Verse 14 tells us he will rely on deception. Paul tells us that his coming will be in accordance with how Satan works, and then goes on to describe wonders and lies. 2 Thessalonians 2 verse 9. Lies, Jesus tells us in John 8:44, are the native language of the beast's very inspiration, Satan himself. Jesus also tells us Satan has been wielding lies from the beginning. He's the father of lies, as he's described, which he employs to commit murder. John agrees in his little letter of 1 John 3 separate times that the spirit of Antichrist is known by its delight in spreading falsehoods, especially about Jesus. But lies are not his only instrument. Again, verse 15 tells us that resorting to force is by no means too low for him. In addition to exercising violence, he will coerce by denying access to trade and for anyone who will not receive the mark of his ownership. Power-driven, accepting no limitations or the rights of any limit makers over him, lusting after ownership of every person's soul, assaulting all things holy in excessive irreverence, malicious, murderous, ruthless, deceptive, and feeding off of the people that he rules for his own benefit. That is the mark of Antichrist's rule. Of course, people read that and their curiosity about this passage, once again, is to gain knowledge about the future. Who's this figure? Where will he come from? When will he come? Just what can we expect? And all of those are appropriate questions. But the final days of the world as we know it are not the only reason why this passage has been given to the church, as if they're only relevant for the final generation. They've always been relevant to our place in society right now. 1 John 2 verse 8 tells us that you and I live in the last hour, and Antichrist is coming. But here's a quote. Even now, many antichrists have come. The Apostle Paul agreed, saying that the secret power of lawlessness is already at work. 2 Thessalonians 2, verse 7. Do you see what this clearly means for us? The rule of Antichrist is already upon us. Are we recognizing it? Two kingdoms are already battling in the cosmos. They have been since the garden. Ours is not a story of a new kingdom suddenly appearing at the end with Antichrist, but merely a new period when the dragon at last gains the dominance over the earth that he has always lusted after. Because you see, just before the end, he and all who love him will have what they have desired for, like they've never had it. For God will briefly, according to 2 Thessalonians 2, verse 7, remove that which holds him back. And what do you think the earth will find when they achieve their dreams? Peace? Freedom? Surely not. I expect the reason why God would pull back instead of just ending things is so the nature of rebellion against him will be known firsthand by its results, so that his judgment will be confirmed by every witness. You're right. Rebellion kills. But here's the question that lies before us today. If that kingdom, which will one day be exposed, is already among us, where in the ages do you and I sit? I don't mean merely time-wise. I don't mean the question, how close are we to the end? That's a good question too, but it's not the first one we should ask. I mean, since that kingdom already ebbs and flows and always has throughout the history of human affairs, how close are we in nature or in conditions to that rule? Since there are many antichrists at work in the world today. This seems the most relevant question for the church. None of the definitive signs of the end have occurred yet. The Antichrist has not appeared. The signs prophesied about the sun, the moon, the stars, the earth, and natural resources have not occurred. But who can deny that many fulfillments are closer than ever? Global government? Yeah, that's really realistic. We have things like the UN that are extending their power every day. Maybe they have a role in it. And we've definitely been globalized. I mean, we're able to connect across the whole face of the earth at any time. So we could be ruled across the face of the earth at any time. Technology has also allowed us to observe and influence our populations like never before. A primer for the kind of totalitarianism that is described in Revelation 13. And the instigation of a mark on the body that could control identity and commerce, that's old news. We could literally implement that tomorrow. There's a lot of groups working on it, and their major obstacle is legal, not technological. How close could we be? But if Revelation 13 won't be fulfilled in our time, and that's a possibility too, because none of the definitive signs have yet taken place, is there nothing to learn from these prophecies? Of course there is. We are intended throughout every age to be able to identify the appearance of God's enemy, however he manifests, and to resist his presence. And so I want to spend the next few weeks observing the nature of our times, the future our generation must prepare for, and how we can prepare for it. To evaluate our own time, we must not only learn from the future, but from the past as well. We have seen Antichrists exercise great power already, and most of the prophecies we have about the future were meant to describe what is now past as well as what is to come. I'll give you an example. King David was promised in 2 Samuel 7 that a son would come from him who would rule on his throne and build the temple, and who would be considered God's own son. Well, lo and behold, David has a son named Solomon, who does rule on his throne and does build the temple and is called God's son. And so he fulfills the prophecy, but only in part, because there was more prophecy to it that was meant to speak to another person who would fulfill it in vaster measure. There will be no end to his rule. Guess what? There was an end to Solomon's rule. But Jesus Christ, the Son of David, who rebuilt the temple with living stones, you and I, is the real Son of God to whose throne there will be no end. This is always going on in the prophets. Daniel does the same thing with his, what would be called Antichrist figure. He prophesies, for example, that one day that one would come and defile the temple in Jerusalem. And lo and behold, not long after Daniel's death, Antiochus Epiphanes of Greece does come and defiles the temple. And yet, as much as that was fulfilled and intended by Daniel's prophecy, there will be a greater fulfillment in the end when the temple is desecrated again. Same with John in writing Revelation. It's not either it's all been fulfilled in the past or it's all future. John knows he's speaking about Rome at the time he writes. The city on 7 hills is Rome. And he knows that a beast has already arisen, many Roman emperors who already demand worship as God from the Christians. And yet, a final one will come who puts them all to shame. Do you see? Many kingdoms have already come that are Antichrist. In our own era, we've seen the demonic kingdom explored in a different way than Greece and Rome did. We call this totalitarianism, and I've used the word a couple of times already, but it's time for us to define it. You see, many kingdoms have been authoritarian. That is, they exercise massive influence over the actions and behaviors of their citizens. They tell their people what to do. But totalitarianism is different. It was first defined by the Italian dictator who allied himself with Hitler in World War II. Benito Mussolini described totalitarianism hauntingly when he said it's everything within the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. Whoa. It gives me chills. Everything within the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. In other words, totalitarianism was invented as a genuine effort for the state to gain ownership of the entire human being. Eating, sleeping, speaking, thinking, all things belong to the ruler. The unique contribution to demonic rule that totalitarianism brought to the world less than 100 years ago has been described as dictatorship of thought and word, as well as action. It's not enough to control behavior. A human must be nothing beyond the state. The state must control truth. Does this sound anything like Revelation 13? Is there anything to this argument that many antichrists have already come? So even thinking in these states, apart from the state itself, is criminalized. Thought crimes is what we call them. No regime has ever fully succeeded at owning the truth for everyone. Really not even close. But many have tried hard and gotten far. All through Soviet Europe, China, Cambodia, Vietnam, Nazi Germany, and fascist Italy, leaders saw success in droves of citizens they produced by educating them, informing them through media, and shaping them into righteous statist instruments for the glory of whatever nation. That is unattested fact. It is fact. It is real. In North Korea, for example, the state has so thoroughly achieved devotion from the population that children frequently inform on their parents, even to the parents' death. Thought crimes, chief among which was holding Christian faith, have been reported and prosecuted in all of the nations I've listed. Totalitarianism very much aims to offer a religion of its own to the people, though that religion is almost always an atheist one. It provides a creation story about a big bang and undirected evolution. It provides a story of sin and the fall, about class division and slavery and exploitation. It provides a redemption story about revolution and victims getting vengeance on people and the Savior, which is the party. And it provides a promise: utopia, paradise, the perfect society. All of these religious elements are leveraged to pull citizens together with a sense of meaning in their lives, solidarity in purpose, and direction in pursuit. To achieve the paradise on earth that these puppet masters aim for, they require religious adherence to their truth. Belief must be controlled or change might not happen, and this is why other faiths like Christianity are intolerable. Listen, I am telling you that when Scripture speaks about Antichrist even now in the world, it's warning us that just such regimes are good examples, apparent examples of Antichrist rule already among us. It's painted all over the descriptions we've read from Revelation 13, Daniel 7, Daniel 11, 2 Thessalonians 2. And it's the reason that Christians are at endless conflict with the rule of the enemy through totalitarianism. We can cooperate to a certain degree with dictatorship, even where we know people are being mistreated. For example, we can mine salt in a prison camp. Yeah, we can do that, and God can call us to do it. We can comply with countless actions required of us, but we can never, ever, ever surrender our minds or our worship to anyone but God. Christians have absolutely no place in totalitarianism except as combatants. Now let me say as a culture, in case you're wondering, that we are not at this point. We're just not. There is a strong measure of freedom in our nation by any historical standard, even in light of our controversies going on right now with COVID. And yet where we are as a people in relation to the horrors we read about across the ocean is a question that we should be asking in every generation. Is it realistic that we could get there? Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and I don't know if that's how you pronounce it, I've heard a dozen different ways. English are not meant to speak Russian. He spent time in the Soviet prison camps, and he thought that we needed to know it could happen here. That's why he spent much of his life preparing an 800-page chronicle of his own experience and the experiences of others called the Gulag Archipelago to warn us that it could happen here. If it were to happen, how quickly would it happen? How would it happen? How would we recognize that it was happening? What would happen to the church? And this is really what I want, is what could we do about it? How does the church thrive in trials? These are questions I want us to consider over the following weeks. And no, I'm not attempting to capitalize on the sensationalism of COVID restrictions to paint our government as totalitarian, except insofar as people are now interested in these questions. Because now it's like, maybe the world I know isn't the world I thought I knew. And we got a bunch of Christians who are either Romans 13 Christians or Revelation 13 Christians, and it doesn't seem like there's any scripture in between or any possible discernment. I would like us to find middle ground of wisdom and discernment. Our governments today in the West, for the most part, are actually not the place that we should be most concerned about. They're not without their signs of danger. There are some very real ones, especially happening in Canada right now. But government is downstream from the culture, and our public creates it. First, we have to search our public then. It may be a good place to start by searching ourselves to see where danger really lies. But in order to do that, we should note some patterns that have appeared in totalitarian nations, so we can see if those patterns are among us. So we can say, hey, how do we plan and thrive in what's before us? Let me spend the last couple minutes of our sermon, it's more than a couple, looking at two more questions to prepare us for the future. How has the demonic rule of totalitarianism manifested itself in the past so that we can identify its influence today if it's there? And secondly, and here's really where we should want to get, how can we worship God appropriately by appreciating how different his rule is? First, what are the key markers that a culture is falling into Antichrist's totalitarianism? Here are three. Number one, the culture is being stripped of meaning and sources of truth. Number two, a minority begins to control conversations about truth. Number three, dissenters are marginalized, suppressed, and removed from public conversation. Let's start with one. A culture is stripped of meaning and sources of truth. If you're going to implement a new religion, as I've said that totalitarianism is, the old has to go. To chase new meaning, one has to unseat the meaning people already have. And a new way of life means death for the old one. In the years leading up to World War II, most people don't know that totalitarianism was widely popular across the globe. Numerous nations across the Atlantic were drawing up plans to implement some measures of totalitarianism, including nations that would eventually fight the Nazis. Russia and China were already practicing it. And even Times Magazine here in North America championed it to some degree when they declared Adolf Hitler, the poster boy for totalitarianism, to be Man of the Year in 1938. Not Time's proudest moment. But there was very little gain in popularity in the general population of America. And so some radicals, like Antonio Gramsci speaks for them, who was an Italian Marxist, started to look for why has there been so much resistance to this thinking. He found 4 institutions to blame. In fact, there may be a 5th. And he called socialists to overcome them if the dream were ever to become a reality. They would have to overcome the family, the church, the media, and schools. And so totalitarian regimes have actively worked to destroy all these institutions and have definitely, as we've talked about in future, have seen success in our population. Let's start with the family. You could destroy that institution by normalizing divorce and adultery, and that was done. You could do it by undermining fathers in public eye, and that was done. And you could often find ways to promote drunkenness, and guess what? Drunkenness is a quick way to tear the family apart. How about churches? Well, you could use different ways. China, for example, long ago and even to this day, forced churches to register if they wanted to be legal. Then the government could monitor the church closely for all that it teaches, and it could forbid like inconvenient truths, virgin birth, the resurrection of Jesus and heaven, which you have to kind of set aside or bury if you're going to be a registered church in China today. Just having an atmosphere in the church where the state has cameras and people coming in to check your notes and so forth presents an unmistakable point that the state is above the church and might be enough. It undermines the institution and places devotion to the state first. In Russia, in living memory, these kinds of registries of churches and populations in the church were used to systematically track down door to door and exterminate Mennonites and other minority groups. We have the survivors and children of victims still living in our communities today that remember this. That's why our church will not keep a registry of anyone who attends here. Not because we think we're in the same situation, but we never want to set that principle. Media. Media in totalitarian states are controlled and told what to say. Media sources are often government funded, and dissenters end up disappearing as an incentive to others for compliance. Schools. Spend some time on this one. It's one of the most useful methods of controlling the population in these states. Think of Romania, which is not unique, where schools were highly effective in convincing children that their parents' Orthodox Christianity and their old ways were outdated and destructive for progress and had to be put down. Kids were better than their parents. China's schools heavily indoctrinated children to give up the 4 olds: old ideas, old culture, old habits, old customs. These were chanted every single day. Only once kids learned to give these up and gave them up could the nation prosper. This means severing students from their past. And history is heavily attacked in those places where Antichrist prevails because history is full of evidence of God's presence, His justice, His power, and it gives us wisdom, perspective beyond our own times. History is often simply neglected in failing states, though a rewriting of history is helpful for propaganda purposes. Without history, people have no perspective but what they currently see, what can be controlled by the powerful. They fall into useful thinking and useful compliance without being challenged by a realistic alternative. Totalitarian states have also made undirected evolution a central aspect of education. Obviously on a spiritual level, because many think it means God is unnecessary. But evolutionary theory is incredibly helpful for remaking meaning and morality, for making it relative. Because it upends every other source of meaning and reality and says, well, let's start again. And guess what? We can tell you where it comes from. Furthermore, evolution is used as a tool by atheistic teachers who aim to convince their students God does not exist. And therefore, the church is a defunct institution to be replaced by the state. Overcoming the institutions that have always brought meaning and truth to a people was a key goal of the rule of Antichrists in the past, and it still is in the present. Leaving individuals on their own and without the defense of memory, reason, and wise traditions, they stand alone, and that doesn't just make them weak, but lonely and looking for a savior. Enter the state. Removing institutions has also been helpful in removing any idea that there was an authority, an existence, a reality bigger than you and me. If the state could convince you that humans are the end and author of all meaning, they could convince you that they were the humans meant to define that meaning for you. Everything you could think, want, or need could be provided by the party. Everything within the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. Compared to the downer of a God who warns that not everything that you want for yourself is good, the party caters to your desires wherever it can. It's much nicer to affirm your every whim than to ask you to bow to a higher power, until you notice that your pleasures are deadly. Okay, so that is the removing of meaning and truth sources. The second is controlling conversations about the truth. The Antichrist rule lives off of lies, because no one in the right mind would choose to give complete ownership of their minds and bodies to a ruler that does not care about them. So Antichrists carefully preen their fabrications, controlling what is said in the public square. Allowing free speech is out of the question because truth is powerful, so truth would win. We've already mentioned the state control of media and schools to control truth. Another massive factor is changing language. Words that once meant one thing are quietly redefined with the hope that people won't even notice the redefinition, and they usually don't. Think about words today like justice, marriage, equality, tolerance, and you'll have some idea of how changes in language radically change conversations. Thirdly, marginalize, suppress, and remove dissenters. To ensure that truth is controlled, just make sure that inconvenient people are not taken seriously. Create a class of write-offs who are utterly ignored. It's best if you can make them seem subhuman so they have no worth to people. This is what China did, for example, to the people whose property it stole en masse during the Great Revolution. It would be inconvenient if those people cried out in their outrage and their pain and were considered valid human beings. So they vilified 5 groups of people in what they called the black category. And every child was to memorize these categories. You don't take seriously landlords, rich farmers, people who resisted the revolution, people who had a government defined by bad influence, or anyone who wanted to conserve the history and traditions of our people. In other words, conservatives. Voila. Marginalized means silence. Now, this effort had a secondary benefit. By creating a common enemy, these were the real danger in our society, you can unite other people to follow you against them. And you can discourage them from looking too closely at yourself and your fitness to lead. 2 birds with 1 stone. These are the ones tearing down our culture. Look at them, not us. In addition to this, by violent acts on dissenters and their property, by legally oppressing, you could suppress further dissent and make an example out of would-be heroes. And if all else failed, and it often did, because large numbers of dissenters still seemed like people to people and would get a hearing, just send people away. Russia created a massive web of prison camps called gulags that saw tens of millions of prisoners through its time. So has every totalitarian regime. A new and especially urgent category of criminal is created, the political criminal, and they are treated with special justice. These prisoners are not only helpful for making dissidents disappear, these prisons are also helpful for dealing with inconvenient allies. Or don't you know that the first victim of totalitarian leaders are always the people who help to get them to power? The Russians have a name for this: useful idiots. It's a cruel one, and yet it's precisely how they see it. When Castro conquered Cuba, his fellow revolutionary leaders who had fought tooth and nail with him were the first to be put to death. When Stalin won World War II, his most decorated generals were his greatest threat, and they couldn't be tolerated any longer. They disappeared. Even his heroic soldiers, when they returned home, never reached the front door. They were put in prisons in hundreds of thousands, never to be seen again, if they'd seen too much of the world and rubbed shoulders with the potentially corrupting forces of the Western Allies. This is a brief description of the common traits of the rule of antichrists, so that we can measure our times for ourselves and respond with wisdom. If you think I've spent too much time dwelling on them, listen, just press forward, because history is theological. We have to learn from it and understand it through our scriptures. What I want you to see today is that the horrific regimes of this world arose not merely because of ignorance, but spiritual oppression, and they show patterns of spiritual oppression. That oppression is even now in this world. Many antichrists are at work. How does Clive Baptist respond? Again, I'm not going to be sensational in creating false fear in the coming weeks, but I will aim to be balanced and optimistic that God is preparing the church for what's to come so they can achieve greater victory and spiritual depth in difficult times. Really not spiritual death, write that one off. Spiritual depth through difficult times. So let us end by rejoicing in how different the rule of God is from what we've described from history, and being grateful to the maximum for the way he rules. First, God has no need to build his rule on lies. This is such an enormous blessing. A Christian is able to serve God in peace, full peace between body, heart, and mind. There's no conflict. We are able to pursue truth fearlessly, not because we believe we can answer all questions, but we believe that all questions can be answered, and that answers set us at peace with God and one another. We do not have to deny truth or choose between truth. We don't have to suppress questions in order to achieve good things. God does not deceive us to get us to do what he wants, and we don't have to deceive ourselves to do what's right. He transforms our minds with truth and lets us delight in perfect harmony between what we believe, what we say, and what we do. He invites questions. I love this because I've got tons of them. He invites questions. He puts no shame on a person who doesn't yet know answers, or a person who wonders, wow, that's surprising. How could that be? Could you show me? Curiosity, governed by disciplined investigation, is godly and invited in the church. We are to chase answers, and we better become that kind of a place. And in the kingdom of Antichrist, no one is safe. Rulers rule on the backs of their people to advantage themselves, and their rule is so insecure because it's made up of lies and exploitations, so they constantly fear mutiny if truth breaks out. For this reason, they rule harshly, and people obey from fear. The pettiness of some of the stories is unbelievable because of insecurity. Not so our God. He, who had a right to wrath because of our destructive ways, instead gave the life of his Son for us. He looks for our good constantly. Is there any denying it? He is a selfless God who descends to serve out of the genuine goodwill he has for people other than himself. He's looking out for more than number one. He's self-giving, not self-serving. Sure, he has to call us from sin because he cannot make death life. He cannot make self-harm health. He leads us instead to truth so we can become healthy, so we can cooperate with our nature with full enthusiasm. There's no insecurity in him. He's never petty because he cannot be overthrown. What should he fear? There's no threat to motivate cruelty like it is in human leaders. So in his justice, he's always gracious and kind. He has given us a significant measure of free will because he cannot be overthrown. He has allowed this time for us to choose our treasure, to choose our course, and we will receive the love of our hearts. What will we love? Though he has a purpose for us, and though he's planned the details of our lives to work together, he has not interfered to remove free will, but he has allowed your choices to find meaning in a bigger story that he has knit together. He does not need to micromanage and coerce as earthly tyrants constantly do. He has the wisdom and the security to govern free beings. Praise be to God. He can govern free beings. This is a God I can give full ownership of my being to. He and he alone is worthy of receiving it. And because of that, his people will appear different than the people in the dark kingdom. I close with a Chinese proverb that is really directing the whole purpose of the weeks to come. One of the proverbs from their great tradition that survived the Great Revolution. It's this: it is better to light one candle than to curse the darkness. It is better to light one candle than to curse the darkness. My point in this series, which I have called The Winds of Change, is that we can learn to light a candle that celebrates goodness. And that is an alternative to either being ignorant of evil around us or embittered towards evil. Instead, we can do something productive. And then we can invite those wandering around us to gather around this candle in dark times. I want you to end by, as we always do, pausing for questions and prayer. Questions. Number one, was it news to you that Antichrist is not merely a future figure, but a description of the enemy's rule throughout history? How does this thought change the way you think about everything? Number two, do you see any of the key markers of antichristly rule present in the society in which we live? We'll talk about this more later. Do you have any such leanings in yourself? What should we do about those leanings that we notice in ourselves or society? And finally, number three, why do you think people will and do cooperate with antichrists? What defense do you have against such temptations? Let's close with our prayer list. Pray that the church will be a bastion of disciplined truth-seeking in our times. Neither a Romans 13 nor a Revelation 13 Christian, but both and. Pray that we will not be divided by distractions, drawing lines away from the real battlefront. That is a severe danger right now. Pray that we will be alert to the real dangers that persist and grow through challenges like the one our nation currently faces. That we will unify on the greatest threats, not being led astray by our pet projects, and so become without use in the battle of our times. Pray desperately for conviction of truth for yourself and the entire body. Pray for the church to light a real candle in increasingly dark times. Pray that we face trials with enthusiasm for the work God accomplishes by them, yet not failing to mourn and resist the evil that creates those trials. And finally, continue to pray for this season of COVID and COVID restrictions and all of the trials that people are facing, for wisdom, for safety and health, especially for Clive Baptist and Clive Community, and for our churches to be able to persist in worship. God bless you, and I hope this really stirs on your heart. We'll speak again, and don't worry, in the coming days, we're going to have shorter in-person services here, which will mean shorter sermons as well. So get ready for that. God bless.